The magic mirror tempts Lily's white daughter. 1951. You could pass, say the mirror. Fine comb slide through your hair, slide through your glory. You could pass, and if sun don't see your skin, you could marry some white man, have little white babies. If the sun don't see your skin, you the fairest of them all. Fair is foul, Ruth tell the mirror. White right ain't all it seem. I don't want no long-haired glory. I don't want no white-bread man. I want mama rainbow babies. And if the sun don't see my skin, then my eye don't see the sun. Foul is fair, she tell the mirror. Take back your filthy air. But they will take you, say the mirror. They will let you in their front door. You don't need no paper bag test. You got whiteness on your side. And they will take you in their parlor. They will take you in their bedroom. They will seat you at their table. They will walk you down their aisle. And you could pass, say the mirror. Fine comb slide right through your hair. Why you don't pass? Ruth say, I is a woman who don't care about no hair. No white skin save the Savior. And no white skin save Mama Lily. Death come knocking anyhow. And no fine comb save my darling brother. And when he bleed, his blood run red just like a black man bleeding. And he dead, just like a white man dead. And so my skin and hair don't mean nothing. And comb don't resurrect the dead, and skin return to blind earth, just like blood rolled to the ground. And if the dirt don't see no difference, why should I? And then Ruth break the magic mirror.
Can you explain the paper bag test?
The paper bag test was a test that was used to distinguish people of color of acceptable shade from people of color of not acceptable shade. And the idea was that if you were as light as a paper bag or lighter, that was something that was valued. Sometimes they'd have these paper bag parties where they would have a paper bag hanging up on the door or nearby the door, and if you were too dark, if your skin was darker than the paper bag, you would not be allowed entry to the parties.
Tell me a little bit about Sister Lily. I still have to call her Sister Lily because to me she's always Sister Lily.
Yeah. Oh, my grandmother. Wow. She was a very complex woman. Most people who knew her, including us, saw a very devout woman who was one of the few in those days born again people. It's very common in the Bahamas today to be born again, but when I was a child, when I was growing up, it was not so usual. People were Christians and they went to church, but they went to established churches and they did not identify themselves as having been born again. There were a few people who did. My grandmother was one of them, and she identified herself, I guess, through her faith, but there were a whole lot of other things going on. For one thing, she was a very, very, very white-skinned woman who was not white. She was the child of a brown Bahamian woman. I say brown. I never knew my either of my great grandmothers, who was born in Baintown, which is one of the liberated African settlements, one of the areas of black settlement in the Bahamas. My grandmother was illegitimate, as were both of her siblings. She had one sister and one brother, both of them considerably darker than herself. Each of them had a different father. Her father was a white man from England who had his own fame. And she turned out white. And the story that is told about her birth is that her mother had disgraced her family by getting pregnant out of wedlock. And so as respectable families, no matter where they were in Nassau at that time, which was 1903, 1904, sent her off to have the child. Sent her to Abaco, one of the islands in the northern Bahamas, to have the child. And when she came back, she had two children. And one was this little white baby, who grew up in Baintown, and I imagine that my grandmother was completely out of place because she for all intents and purposes, looked pretty well white. Growing up in Baintown, that must have been difficult. And she married another person of fair-ish complexion, my grandfather, who was nowhere near as light as my grandmother, but who was also the product of an illegitimate union. And his mother had been basically disowned by her family, who were highfalutin, high yalla, Bahamians of color, who didn't actually make it in white society, but were really working hard to do so. And this child of theirs went off and had this son by this man who was too black, certainly couldn't pass the paper bag test. And so they gave her a house on the edge of town and sent her there. And so her son met my grandmother, and the two of them got married. And it's a very interesting union in terms of race in the Bahamas at that time. They were, I don't even know how to call it, they were not middle class. My grandfather was a carpenter. My grandmother was a baker, cook, whatever, and a housewife until my grandfather died. And both of them had been exiled from whatever communities they were part of for their illegitimacy and for their color. And so they raised their children in a very interesting fashion, very colorblind kind of way. The products of that kind of a marriage could be any color. And they, in fact, had 6 children, and 3 of them were white-ish, very, very fair, could definitely pass the paper bag test, and the other 3 were not and couldn't. And in other families at that time, parents would have made a distinction between the 3 white and the 3 black children. But my grandparents did not make any distinction. They raised all their children in the same way. And as I said, that was very unusual for the time and for the congregation to which they belonged. The congregation was made up of people who are all very much like themselves, but most of the people in the congregation had serious hang-ups about being of color, whereas my father's family didn't seem to have those hang-ups.
In one of your first poems, you talk about the Obia woman. Can you say?
Yeah, my grandmother has, well, okay, I've told you a bit about how she was produced. And I think she had, and I talk about her complexity, and part of her complexity was that for most of her life, she got on much better with her mother-in-law than she got on with her mother. I think she blamed her mother for having born her illegitimately and having created this white child who didn't have any place in the society. But at the same time, her mother was also the reason, to some degree, why she was who she was, in 2 respects. One was, it was with her mother that she got saved. That's a different story from when you asked me, when she was 10. My grandmother was 10. But 5 years before that, when my grandmother was 5, the story goes that her mother took her to see the Holy Woman. And in my poem, I call her the Obia woman because I imagined her as a liberated African who was wise, holy, whatever. But in celebration of the Africanness, I use the word Obia. Whatever the case, the story goes, my grandmother was taken to see this woman, and as she walked in the room, the woman said, "I see a dark cloud over that child's head. She is going to bury her husband and all her children." And my grandmother did. So yeah, I don't know what that, I don't know how that defined her. I have a sense to some degree that her faith was in part protection against that prophecy. But it didn't change the prophecy in any way. All my grandmother's children died before her, as did her husband. She was a widow by the time she was 39. Um, and yeah, she buried my aunt. We buried my aunt 3 weeks before my grandmother died. So the prophecy came true, which is fairly remarkable.